quick announcement on the Wirewheel side. We're very excited to announce that we've just launched our new universal preference and consent platform. It's now generally available. And our new platform is really addressing those critical needs, specifically around some of the new laws in the United States and globally. And we're really, looking forward to working with companies, helping really solve for some of the new requirements around the country, especially around the Sephora enforcement decision in California.
Welcome, everybody. I'm super excited about this panel coming from a GRC background. It's really important to me. And I think, as we're building out privacy programs, we so often forget to incorporate, risk decisions into it. And so we kind of end up chasing our tails, trying to solve every problem that we can. But with that, I just want to quickly introduce our two panelists here, and Barb Lawler and Martin Abrams. Barb, do you want to take it away?
Sure, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This session really ties together three major research initiatives of the Information Accountability Foundation. And what Marty and I will be talking about are kind of three distinct areas. First, we'll touch on really reframing data risk, but also data sustainability as a corporate governance issue. We'll talk a little bit about how data risk and data sustainability interoperate, what that looks like. Those two first sections come out of a joint initiative that's kind of an interesting cross-functional group between Marty and myself, along with Dan Caprio and Jonathan Lichtman, some of you may know. They are the Providence Group. They focus on crisis planning and tabletop exercises. And then many of you know and have probably read the book by Professor Neil Richards, Why Privacy Matters. Neil is also a part of our discussion team as well. Then Marty will go into a little bit deeper dive on what it means to actually look at risk in terms of all stakeholders, taking into account, depending upon where you are in the world, either fundamental rights or fundamental interests, what's that looks like, and giving that a visual perspective that we think really helps organizations make decisions and just think through risk to all stakeholders. And then leading that into what are specific risks to people and a little bit of a fresher way to think about that and what that means, and then ultimately kind of the close on that. So Marty and I work for the Information Accountability Foundation. He is our founder. I am our president. Marty has been a thought leader in information policy and governance for, Marty, we've settled on about 40 years at this point. I only have 22 years in the space before doing other things. So I've been a chief privacy officer 3 times at 3 different companies. So between Marty and I, we bring big strategy and vision as well as some operational perspective to this stuff. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to Marty and kind of set the stage for us around data sustainability and what that means from a corporate strategy and governance perspective. Marty.
Okay, so well, thank you very much. And I just want everybody to understand the question of risk and risk to who and risk to why is not a compliance issue. This is actually an issue that relates to the ability of an organization to be successful over time. We live in a highly observational world where there are sensors on everything, and we collect an incredible amount of data, and that data is incredibly important to our future success as organizations. And I think nothing illustrates that more than Formula One. Formula One is the most expensive and the most interesting part of auto racing. I love it and have followed auto racing since the late 1960s. And by far the most successful team in auto racing over the last decade has been the Mercedes team, and Lewis Hamilton is the driver. And there was a whole change in the formula this year, and everything in Formula One is recorded. All of the pit crew wear sensors so that we understand how well they did on the pit stops, which last under 3 seconds. The drivers, we record every single every part of the car has sensors on it, and the fact is that there's this ton of data that is collected as part of the operation of the car. Well, the new formula this year, the most successful team in racing did not win a race. That team only won one race, and Lewis Hamilton, one of the best drivers ever, did not run any races. And it's because they did a really poor job of observing what they need to observe and translating that into knowledge and being able to turn that knowledge into action. So please change the slide. So the fact is that there is a path to innovation that exists in a digital age. And that path to innovation begins with the data. The fact is that we collect tons of data. We collect tons of data from multiple sources. We tons of it from multiple sensors. It's many types of data that's self-contributed, it's observational, and it's data that we actually create. But that data is useless until we then, Barb, turn it into information. And that translates data into something that's useful. So data in itself is not useful. It has to be translated. There's lots of work that goes into translating that data into something useful. The military talks about information superiority. They don't talk about data superiority. And it's because it's the information that makes it possible to do things with data. And ultimately, that data needs to be turned into knowledge. So knowledge is all the inferences that we come up with from that data, all of the insights, all of the things that let us predict future behavior. And that goes from how well a CPAP machine runs to the ability to place an ad in front of someone that is the most useful. And last but not least, data needs to turn into action. And if you look at the colors back on the last slide, you'll notice that the first three are blue. And that action is green. There is a distinct break between our creation of knowledge and deciding that it is the most appropriate thing to apply that knowledge in the form of action. And action is almost everything we do with data. It's as simple as a credit card transaction approval, and it can be as complex as understanding whether the symptoms predict a future outbreak of a disease. So the fact is the steps we take are the action that comes with information. And it's the actions that are highly risky to individuals, while it's the processing of the information that makes it possible to actually take those actions. So there needs to be a break from this concept of actions and decisions to the actions that we take with data. Now, let me give it back to Barb.
Thanks, Marty. So what we want to do next is actually tie all this together. And the next couple of slides are actually from Andy Serwin, who is also a part of that cohort I mentioned earlier. And he's a practice leader, both globally and internationally at DLA Piper. He thinks a lot about corporate governance. And the framework that we've developed is this idea that so that there's risk around data. And as Marty mentioned in that digital continuum is that we start with data, we move to information that then drives knowledge. Knowledge is what then drives action, which can be physical actions, digital actions, decisions that we make. I think if you were to step back, how many in your organization, in your peers, and your executives are thinking about data sustainability, or frankly, even data risk, except perhaps in certain narrow constructs that really fall into the compliance bucket? And that's the pathway on the left here in the red boxes, compliance, and we look at what's happening with regulators, what's happening in the courts. And that affects how companies are making decisions on where to invest in greater effectiveness of their digital innovation lifecycle that Marty described. But what we see is that if we can reframe the data risk discussion into a combination of compliance and resiliency, and considering where there are other stakeholders beyond just the organization itself that may not have a direct say, but influence how the marketplace, how individuals think about how a company is using data to create information and knowledge, and ultimately to drive actions, and that creates business resiliency, and that drives data sustainability. And So usually what you see at the very top level, at the board level of governance for a company, they're really focused on three big areas: business strategy, what is the company's business model or business models, how will they succeed over the next 5 to 10 years on that horizon planning. Operational resiliency, this is everything from all your infrastructure, manufacturing, delivery of services, that is sustainable, 100% online and works. Where we tend to center is in that world of legal compliance around privacy and data risk. And what we're really suggesting is to come at this from a different perspective, particularly when talking at the C-level and with the board around data, and that business strategy, operational resiliency in particular are driven by data resiliency. And so you don't forget legal compliance, but it's an and, not an or. And if you tie that all together with sustainability at the center, there are a number of governance frameworks that bring all of those different pieces together for the board level to think about and actually provide guidance on what are sustainable actions as it relates to information and knowledge creation and actions based on that. And so what we'll then jump into next is, so what does it mean to really think about the different stakeholders that we saw on this initial slide, particularly in the blue, but also in the red? And what does it mean to actually weigh and take into account their considerations? And so Marty is going to talk about that. And we're calling that multidimensional proportionality. You can think of that as a new way to think about the longstanding privacy principle of proportionality. You can think about it as enhanced proportionality, actionable proportionality, but the point is it is not a binary, it is not an either or. And so Marty is going to jump into that. So I will turn it back to you.
Well, thank you very much. And as we think about the whole concept of data sustainability, we have to think about the way the world is reacting to things that go wrong in the digital world. So the fact is that it's no longer about actions that lead to fines, that lead to embarrassment. We're now seeing actions taken by regulators that say you have to get rid of the data, you have to get rid of the intellectual property created with the data. One just needs to look at the cases like the Weight Watchers case from a few years ago, or the more recent case in Europe where the Danish regulator said that all of the Chromebooks that were in the public schools had to be junked because they were linked to the cloud, and the cloud created the risk that the data on fourth graders' homework would be used by the NSA in the United States. So the fact, and so you had to get rid of all of those Chromebooks. So the fact is that we have more and more cases which are not about fines and reputation. They're about, you have to get rid of the data. You can't use the data, you can't use the intellectual property. And you begin to graphically see this. So you have a company that has weak security practices. We have the adverse processing impact of stigmatization because of those weak practices. We have people being framed as heavy drinkers, and this is the FTC Drizzly enforcement case. And we have the company penalized at a high level, and we have the board chair penalized as well, because he didn't take action to make sure that there were not the security breaches that led to people being stigmatized and that people being harmed and labeled as heavy drinkers. So it begins to see that it's really about sustainability, and it's about the whole range of stakeholders. Please change the slide.
Marty, do you want
So
me to do the full build on this?
Sure, yes, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
So the fact is that we did a project last year on the risk of what, and what we began to see is risk is seen differently depending on where you are as a stakeholder in the process, and that you can't just think about the company as a stakeholder and the data subject as a stakeholder. You have to think about all the stakeholders who are reacting to the use of information and things that go wrong in the use of information. So you start with the data subject that's in the center. You are the business owner, but we have the media reacting to the sense that there is a power disparity. We have competitors who are interested in what happens to your relationship with your customers. We have policymakers who are trying to make sure that people are happy. We have other persons that are impacted by the sense that that data subject was harmed, and with the regulators who are trying to regain control of the marketplace. So the fact is that when you think about risk, you have to think about the full range of stakeholders and what it means to impact those stakeholders and what form it is and how they look at it. And the fact is that every one of those stakeholders impacts your ability to have data sustainability and therefore business resiliency. Please change the slide. So the fact is that the processing is getting more complex, and that your business strategies are dependent on not just obvious uses of data, but on more complex uses of data, and that your use of data, it relates to one person, impacts others as well. So the fact is that as our processing of data becomes more complex, and as we begin to use machine learning to inform artificial intelligence actions that are the most operationally oriented, the fact is we need a better model, a bigger model that begins to demonstrate where the risks are, who feels the risk, what are the adverse consequences related to it. So we need something more complex to be able to begin to visualize what we're doing with data and what the risks are. Please change the slide. So the fact is that we understand that data protection works on this concept of principles. And there are sets of principles that have been established for decades and decades and decades that date back to work in the United States in the early 1970s, the OECD guidelines from 1980. And the fact is that that you can use those principles to begin to build out new ways of thinking about the way we govern data. And you can do this. And the best example is that the whole principle of accountability was defined by a process that was started by a multi-stakeholder group and called a Global Accountability Dialogue. And all of the laws that now cite accountability are based on that redefining of accountability that took place in 2009. You see it in the GDPR, you see it in all new laws, you see it in the builds out of more modern data protection in Singapore. So the fact is that we can use principles that are well established and begin to give them a different and better and more modern contour. Please change the slide. And the fact is that the term proportionality is built into data protection principles. The fact is that proportionality is seen as a fairly simple concept from mathematics. The fact is that proportionality is about one factor always staying in alignment with another. So if I increase the amount of, if I'm baking, if I increase the amount of flour in a cake, I have to increase the amount of baking soda that goes into, or baking powder that goes into that. So and it's a proportion that stays intact. When we think about proportionality as it relates to government use of data, that has been heavily defined for years. And it goes to the fact that the government's use of data needs to be proportional to the loss of liberty on the part of the individuals. But before you get to this point of proportionality in government use of data, there's already determination of public purpose. So you're balancing that public purpose that has been defined by other factors against this concept of the simple concept of how much liberty is going to be used. The fact is that the present articulation of proportionality doesn't work well when we think about the private sector's use of data. So the way it's been worked out by regulators is it's about the amount of data. So proportionality in existing terms is defined as really data minimization. There's very little difference between proportionality and that dimension. But if we're thinking about complex processing that creates value for multiple stakeholders, we have to give depth and dimension to this concept of accountability, this concept of proportionality, and that we actually have the ability to do that if we think about it in broader terms. Please change the slide. So why is this necessary? Well, the fact is that individuals have multiple interests. They don't just have an interest in autonomy. They have an interest in better healthcare, in education, in not receiving diseases from other parties, in living in a safe society. And the fact is that our processing data that relates to us impacts others. So, for example, if I have if I'm going to use observation of my use of a CPAP, for example, that observation improves the ability of other persons who have sleep apnea to benefit from the use of data. So the fact is, it's not just about us; it's about all the stakeholders that are impacted by the use of data. It's not just about me and the organization; it's about others. So the fact is that a fulcrum-based risk balancing that is just about the individual and the organization is not satisfactory. And if we think about the type of assessments that are going to be required in Colorado and Connecticut going forward, and Virginia, and maybe soon in California when the regs are finalized, they're asking not just what is the impact on the individual, they're also asking what is the impact on groups of individuals and on society as a whole. So this concept of looking beyond just the individual, but multiple stakeholders is going to become online soon as January. So the fact is, and if you think about fair AI regulations, which are emerging in Europe and will emerge soon in the United Kingdom and Canada and eventually in the United States, they're asking that you understand the impact on groups of individuals, protected classes of individuals, and that requires this concept of a multi-stakeholder analysis. And that there's a gulf between this concept of fair AI and the focus of data protection on the individual. Please change the slide. So when we think about fundamental rights from the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, and the fundamental rights are squares. These are all fundamental rights that come from the Charter that have to do with liberty and dignity. So the fact is that data protection is in the center because that's what data protection authorities say, but are expected to protect. But the fact is that recital 4 of the GDPR says the full range of fundamental rights and interests. And these include the ability to have a job, to have an occupation, the ability to get fair education, quality education, the right to conduct a business, the right to be secure in a society and not be at risk from terrorists or others, and the integrity of the person as it relates to their health. All of these are fundamental rights. It's not just data protection, it's this full range of fundamental rights. And all of those fundamental rights are impacted by the processing of information. Change the slide. And if you you can think about it in societies where it's not a fundamental right, that it's an important interest like US and Canada, you can begin to think of it as being represented by oblongs, but they're very similar to the issues that we're talking about in terms of fundamental rights in countries that have fundamental rights. So the fact is that employment aligns with this concept of the ability to have an occupation. Physical safety relates to the integrity of the person. So the fact is that you can begin to represent these fundamental interests just like you can begin to represent fundamental rights. So the analysis you do in, for example, in Colorado would be similar to the analysis, but you might just represent it with a different symbol. Change the slides. And so when you think about the stakeholders, the stakeholders can be represented by the hexagon. The fact is that the data subject is in the middle. The business that's processing the data is aligned with that. But the fact is that all of these other stakeholders are impacted and have an opinion about what is done with data and how it is used, and they're impacted by the decisions we make and the actions that we take with data. So you can't just think about this in terms of the data subject and the business. You have to think about the full range of stakeholders who are impacted by the information, and that can be represented graphically. Change the slide. And if you think about the stakeholders, there can be dozens of stakeholders. My friends who are in the pharmaceutical industry say they've charted 22 different stakeholders who are impacted by clinical research. So the fact is that the stakeholders can be multiple. You probably have to isolate down to the key stakeholders, but the fact is that you can represent all of the stakeholders and give them representation in the process. Change the slide. And as we think about an issue that we're all come to know is the transfer of data from Europe to the rest of the world. That's a key issue that's come into play. And if we think about that in terms of the context of one particular processing of data, let's think of it in terms of HR data. The IAF did research on whether HR data had ever been requested in terms of bulk collection by national security agencies, and the answer is no. So you can begin to think about the stakeholders who are impacted in terms of data for employment review. Obviously, it's the individual as an employee, but it's other employees who want to be treated fairly. It's the regulators that oversee the use of the data, both from an HR perspective and from a privacy perspective. It's the employer that has an interest in how the individual is performing and them as an asset of the organization. And of course, if we're talking about the transfer of data as governed by Schrems II, we're talking about national security interests. So all of those parties are stakeholders to this question of whether HR data can be transferred to another state for analysis. Please change the slide. So as we think about the fundamental rights that are impacted by this transferring of HR data to the United States, for example, for analysis by the organization to determine if the employee should be promoted, should have a raise, whether their compensation is fair as it relates to other parties, we can isolate 4 fundamental rights that come into play. First is this sense of data protection, that my data as an individual is protected in terms of national security agencies having access to my data. We have the organization's ability to conduct business. Can't conduct business if it doesn't have employees. Those employees have to be satisfied. They have to be treated fairly. We have the question of the employee's ability to have employment, their ability to have an occupation and exercise that occupation and be treated fairly in that employment setting. And then we have this question of national security. How is data used to protect me and protect the integrity of my person? So those are, if we're charting and beginning to understand the rights or interests that come into play when we transfer the HR data, these are the ones that come into play. Please change the slide. But we can begin to size them based on the level of risk related to that fundamental right. And I would say that we could actually size them even more precisely. So the fact is the likelihood of that data being accessed by a national security agency in a bulk fashion is pretty low. So that box, that purple box, could be even smaller than we have it on this. Maybe that's brown, but it's either purple or brown, but it's that box. The fact is that physical safety really doesn't come into play in terms of the transfer of HR data. So the interest of the National Security Agency to have access to the data is pretty low. My ability to conduct business is pretty impacted if I can't transfer data and assess whether my employees are being treated fairly, whether they should get a raise, whether they should get a promotion. If I can't do that, it impacts my ability to conduct a business. So that risk is pretty substantial. But the risk that comes most into play is the risk to me being treated fairly as an employee. My ability to have a profession, my ability to be able to get promoted in that, to be treated fairly by my boss. If my data can't be transferred to the United States for my annual assessment or for my compensation or to be recertified on a daily basis that I am indeed an employee and should be and get entered to the facility. The fact is that when you're beginning to weigh these, you can begin to see that from a risk-based perspective, the risk to the fundamental right to employment is very large. The fundamental right to data protection is fairly low. And if I'm doing a risk analysis, being able to physically show the proportion of these to each other begins to give me a demonstrable answer of why it's appropriate from a risk-based perspective to transfer this data. And that's really what we're trying to do is begin to show the fact that you can begin to graphically weigh what you're doing. Now, all of this is contextually based. And the fact is that what we're suggesting is that organizations, as processing gets more complex, are increasingly going to have to demonstrate that their analysis is sound and that they're thinking beyond just the interest of one stakeholder. They're thinking about the interest of others. And this is particularly going to come into play when we talk about the secondary use of data for machine learning, so that we can actually take the actions that are necessary in advanced analytics and AI going forward. So the fact is we have to create the knowledge with the machine learning so that we can then take the actions in terms of the back end that are considered to be fair and just, based on this more graphic ability to demonstrate risk based on multiple factors. And my colleague Barb is going to talk about really the last factor, which is adverse processing impacts. Barb, I turn it to you.
Right, thank you. So a couple of things. The analysis here that Marty's described and the visual demonstration of how you can start to think about, and at least at a high level, identify what is proportional weighting for fundamental rights or fundamental interests. The IAF completed 2 research papers on specifically the issue around employee data transfers from Europe to the US over the last couple of years, and those are available on our website. And at the very end of this material, we've got links on where to find more information, more research work from us. But let me also stop here and see if there are any questions from the audience before jumping into what really is our last section.
Barb, I don't see any questions at the moment, but as you continue, folks, feel free to place a question in the Q&A. We'll be happy to get to them at the end.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we realize this is a lot of pretty dense content, but we thought it was important to bring it to this audience, one of our favorite events to speak at. So what I want to do now is take everything that you've heard and then bring it down, although we've talked about multi-stakeholder efforts and considering risks and impacts to multiple stakeholders. We wanted to also do a deeper dive into risks specifically to individuals. And I do see that there is a question that just came in the Q&A about any point of view on how to quantify data risk. We've had some initial discussions on that amongst our members in not so much economic terms, but more in research terms, and really how you would take just that one very high level example that you saw here, or a couple of examples that Marty described, and looking for a way to actually put some automation around that. So you could, for example, in many corporate environments, you have 100-point exercises where you put 20 points here and 50 here and 10 here and 2 here, that there's a way to scale and put some numbers against it. I think the economic analysis is much more involved, and that could be a follow-on phase to our research, but we have not gone that far yet. Right now, we're focused on really just bringing these ideas out and getting feedback. So really appreciate your thoughts on that.
Go
ahead, Marty.
Just so if you go to the IAF website, you're going to find that starting in 2015, we began to do assessment processes that are manual assessment processes with sets of questions that you answer. And those questions begin to bring forth the issues that lead to relative sizing of risk. What still needs to be done is how you translate sort of the answers to those questions into something graphic. And we have a number of members that are actually trying to take their their data protection impact assessments, broaden them out to the full range of stakeholders, and then begin to have an automated process of doing that. So there are people who are beginning to think about that.
Yeah. And Marty, I think we should actually talk with our policy board and our corporate board about how to take the multi-stakeholder, multi-dimensional proportionality work and put some economic analysis around that. I think that could be really impactful. So, okay, now we're going to jump into the specific area around what we mean by adverse processing impacts or risk to people. And so, where did the terminology come from? One of IF's other research projects was developing model legislation, and although generally targeted at the U.S., really what is designed to be modular and provide, again, as a research and education project, because we are a nonprofit, we do not lobby. One of the key sections in our model legislation, which is called the Fair and Open Use Act, talks about adverse processing impacts. And we thought it was really important. And one of the things kind of missing often from privacy legislative proposals is, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve for citizens and individuals? And from input from many of our community, both members and other stakeholders, not just in the U.S., but certainly in the U.S., was, how do we talk about and articulate processing impacts that can have a negative, potentially a beneficial impact to individuals? And so we thought that this would be valuable to actually bring that out in more detail. And there are reasons why we'd want to do that. And for those of us who've been doing PIAs for many years, some of the issues that we've just talked about, particularly around multiple stakeholders, don't always surface in traditional PIAs. As there's been a shift towards sustainability frameworks, ESG, data ethics approaches, there are often questions that also aren't considered. And so bringing a way to bring those forward. We also thought it was important to actually align with what's coming from the different states, and most important, with work that's already done. And although we haven't touched in depth here, the NIST privacy framework actually articulates what we're calling adverse processing impacts. And I'll go into that on the next page. But one of the values we think is that when you're sourcing from the NIST privacy framework, you can also link that to what's happening on the data security and cybersecurity side with the NIST security frameworks. So the other reason we think this is important is, again, what I was saying before, which is, what are the outcomes and impacts to people, both good and bad, both positive, beneficial, or potentially negative, and actually preventing those and building that thinking up front earlier into the process. And we see a lot of old thinking very often in legislative proposals, and we wanted a way to bring forward some of these different ideas. And so one of our team is Mark Groman. Some of you may have heard or know Mark. He's, among many other things, a former chief privacy officer at the Federal Trade Commission, worked in a number of administrations, and we thought this was a little bit of humor. Okay, so when we think about the NIST privacy framework, it's often used as an assessment tool. We understand it's not a required standard, it's voluntary, but it helps an organization think through all the different, in a very systemic and detailed way, how to consider development, how to consider what the requirements are for data collection, use, storage, retention, and what the detailed operational practices and controls look like. And in particular can help with, I think, the development of systems and products and services, because I think it's pretty clear, when we think about just that data and digital innovation path, that all companies aren't tech companies. Tech companies aren't all companies, but all companies are using technology and are using data. So real quickly, just what the actual NIST source is. You can see the links here to the actual privacy framework. And in particular, the source of what we're talking about is the catalog of problematic data actions and problems associated with that. All right, so we have more colored shapes. This time they are triangles. And so the articulated adverse processing impacts are discrimination, financial loss, Physical harm. So think about some of the things we talked about, fundamental rights and interests. You start to see an overlap. You see psychological harm, see loss of autonomy, the ability to make one's own decisions. Disruption through interruption. That's actually has played a much larger role than what we might think. Just expenditure of time, and we'll talk about that too. Denial of a rights or privilege, that can get to specifics of employment, that can be travel restrictions, and as Marty talked about in the Drizzly example, stigmatization. So what we actually did was bring together with feedback from our community, just some quick examples. So I realize there's a lot of content on this page. We will be able to share that out, but just to give some examples, and particularly the ones that maybe aren't as obvious. I think in recent years, particularly when we talk about certain types of technology, such as social media companies, we think about things like psychological harm. When we think about other technologies as it relates to autonomous and vehicles and so forth, we think more of physical harm, but we think of other harassments. Marty talked about the employment issue. That would be in sort of a negative outcome or decision. And so we want to make sure actually that you're supporting not only appropriate and fair hiring, but also classic anti-discriminatory issues around loan and credit applications and so on. Inconvenience and unwarranted expenditure. I like to highlight that one because when we first developed that one, some in our community said, why in the world is inconvenience a negative impact? And if you've ever tried to cancel a subscription or a recurring charge, or now as we see increased emphasis on the use of dark patterns, whether that's in cookie banners or again, canceling subscriptions or engaging in other services, they can be not only incredibly complex, buried, difficult to exercise, and frankly are designed often in many cases either accidentally or on purpose to not function properly. And so we actually think this one is just as important as the others. On the second page, the remaining four, stigmatization, Marty already talked about. I think we've gotten used to spam and phishing, but disruption and unwanted intrusions, those are everyday annoyances that we all live with. But also classic anti-discrimination concerns around hiring and housing, and we mentioned that on the other page as well. And autonomy, that can be everything from employee monitoring or tracking in the workplace or in the home, or restriction and denial of travel privileges. So that is a very, very quick run through of those 9 adverse processing impacts. And so now you say, so what do I do with that? How does that relate to the proportional analysis? So what we did is we thought it would be helpful to turn those 9 elements into kind of a quick checklist that you can use to supplement your PIA or DPIA processes. And it just gives you just something to take your notes on, or something where you can actually just use this. Does the product service new data use, new third party, change in third party, change in data use, new business model? Gives you just one simple page, a chance to ask those questions. I want to talk real quickly about a privacy by design use case that takes advantage of those. One of the cases that we talked about with our members that are particularly in the data security space is kind of a classic we're now used to, which is data loss prevention services. And so those use a variety of heavy data analysis, real-time technology, data gathering, data processing, data use to block data that shouldn't be exfiltrated, to make sure that the right people are accessing the right data and not transferring it somewhere else. And in particular, to add extra restrictions when it's sensitive information about people. And so when you look at the extensive observability, scanning, data collection, and real-time data processing, DLP identifies and blocks a lot of transmissions. And then you say, could that affect someone's ability to complete a product or service if I'm working from home? Does that prevent me from doing my job? And so we see this as a case that would, one, take advantage of the rights and interest balancing that we talked about, but would also go back to, and in particular apply to potential economic harm, which could be to the organization or to the individual. It might actually impact inconvenience, but we think ultimately there's a stigmatization or reputational question. I may be transferring something for an extremely benign and positive manner, but maybe get flagged as a problematic employee. So that's just a real quick example of what DLP example applied against adverse processing impacts would look like. And really just kind of lastly to wrap up on this part of the content is when you think about software development life cycles, when you think about product development and design, what we're saying is you don't need to do another PIA. These are all kind of new tools to help you think through a bunch of the pieces. So what we've done is put together at different steps of product development and design, whether it's enhancements to current products or to new products, where this fits in to the life cycle as we see it and based on feedback from our members. So just kind of a high level perspective of there's some upfront work to do in terms of initial assessment, but you want to make sure that you're validating before something's launched. But then you want to actually monitor and validate and check that on an ongoing basis along with the other activities that you're doing from an operational perspective. So that actually wraps up the section. Let me just real quickly, I think Marty, we had you do it, but I'll just go ahead and kind of lean into that and then you can close it out and we'll take any additional questions. So how do we use all this? Because this was a lot of stuff and we get that. We use this as substantive content and information that goes into everything from our feedback to the FTC and PR to ongoing US and state legislative and rulemaking efforts, as well as the ongoing efforts to update and refresh the UK GDPR post-Brexit. The proposed two-part Canadian privacy law, C27 is what it's currently called, which has two parts, one an update to PIPEDA, but also a new AI privacy and data protection segment that will have a new AI regulator. We'll be continuing to engage in dialogues on this, both in Canada next month and in Washington around the time of IAPP in early April. And as Marty mentioned, we're going to look at automating some of the risk balancing work. And of course, our members use this extensively internally to build out their governance and data risk and privacy programs. So, Marty, you want to take us home?
Yes, we covered a ton of data, a ton of stuff. And we started with the concept of your data flows have to be sustainable and they have to be able to flow into the way you create new knowledge so that you can take future actions. And this is particularly important as we think about the secondary use of data for machine learning, for the further integration of AI into your business processes. And the fact is that if one focuses only on the organization's desire to use data and the individual's desire for autonomy, it's going to be very difficult to justify that secondary use of data over time. What we're trying to do is create a visualization of who are the stakeholders that you've considered, how have you considered the adverse processing impacts, including the inability to create new knowledge, and be able to sustain your data flows into the creation of information, knowledge, and finally action. And that's going to require something that is more graphically demonstrable and is less binary in terms of companies want to use data and people want to be protected against that use of data, into something that says I have a full range of interests, and how do I show that full range of interest and the full range of stakeholders? They're impacted if I can't create knowledge. And that's what we're trying to do here. Thank you.
And our multi-stakeholder efforts are exactly that as we talk about multidimensional proportionality. So for example, last fall, we held an event in London that include not only members from our business community, but academics, policymakers, a couple of representatives from regulatory organizations in Europe and the UK. And we will continue on that path for our next events. So these are truly multi-stakeholder efforts. And so the input comes from a variety of perspectives. All of those, I think I didn't mention civil society, but civil society as well. So questions? comments? Again, we realize that it's a lot and we will share out the deck and so you can access the information, but here's the information here also on the page. We're always looking for new members. We have a variety of entry points and would love to have additional perspectives and organizations come on board. Questions? Let's see.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Barb and
Thank you,
Marty.
Wanda.
This was an absolutely fantastic panel. Really appreciate it. We had one open question that just said, amazing information and great presentation. Highly agreed. We really appreciate having you guys here at Spokes today. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you in our next session.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.